Hey there, welcome to episode 146 of the Let's Innovate for Vegas audio program. I am your host, Dan Hugo. We are recording this at 3:21 p.m. Pacific Standard Time here in the greater Vegas area on Tuesday, December 2nd, 2025. We normally release these episodes on Tuesdays, so cutting it close, but we'll get it. We'll get it in there. Hopefully everybody had a nice long holiday weekend. Not that you're listening to this on December 2nd, but whenever you had a holiday weekend, hopefully it was nice. Today's title and topic, Cooking with Open Source, our use and maybe reliance and, in fact, requirements regarding open source for all of our initiatives and endeavors. If you are not familiar with the Innovate for Vegas Foundation, or perhaps this is your first time listening to the Let's Innovate for Vegas audio program, very briefly, the Innovate for Vegas Foundation was formerly known as the Code for Vegas Foundation, or Code for Vegas, not the Code for Vegas Foundation, a 501c3 public charity. It's a Nevada nonprofit corporation formed on June 16th, 2022. So we're in our fourth year. We renamed because a lot of people thought that Code for Vegas meant if you're not a coder, this is not for you, but that's very much the opposite of what our intent was. The Southern Nevada area is focused heavily on innovation with the Innovation Center located in the Innovation District. There's a website, innovate.vegas, which is maintained by the City of Las Vegas. Clark County, in which you will find the City of Las Vegas and places that answer to the name Las Vegas, is also focused heavily on innovation. Future developments of an innovation hub, which will be a physical set of buildings on a plot of land on the south part of the sort of the metropolitan area between UNLV campus and the tech park, I believe, if that's still the plan. So innovation figures heavily into the notion of what some believe will be the future of the Southern Nevada, Greater Vegas area. So we fit right into that. Innovation can take many forms. You do not need to be a particular age or have a particular set of skills, but you do have to want to be creative and thus innovative. Our purpose along those lines, which I'll just wait. I'm going to refer to it in our first section, so I'll leave it. But our purpose remains purposely vague on the notion of how we innovate. Just the fact that we do or intend to innovate. And we are a civic volunteer organization, no compensation. I am completely unpaid for all of my efforts, and that kind of fits in with everything else I do. I crack myself up. Hopefully, so the Innovate for Vegas Foundation is a 501c3. Like I said, the Let's Innovate for Vegas audio program is a way to just reach out, connect. We have done interviews. We could do interviews again, or conversations in general. These are mostly audio essays about some of our plans, how we're accomplishing some things, and so on. Trying to shift to more progress than aspiration. It's always fun to talk about what we want to do. It's getting to be about the time we want to talk about what we are doing and what we have done. So Today will hopefully be kind of a transitional episode because we do use a lot of open source, and everything we're doing is open source. So two great tastes. I guess that's really just one great taste, but you know what I mean. So hopefully wherever you found this audio program, you're able to locate the episode description, which contains the show notes, including a brief summary. It's two sentences, one very short, which I'll read to you. And then the links for today's episode, there are two of the normal Innovate for Vegas website links, our two homepages. And then there are two links regarding open source, one for the open source initiative and one on Wikipedia. So let's get started so we can get finished on this lovely Tuesday afternoon. The summary of today's episode: our foundation initiatives are all open source endeavors, and we really like to use open source tools to pursue them. What does that mean? Indeed. Innovate for Vegas activity website is at innovateforvegas.org. Innovate for Vegas, FOR, no spaces. Innovate for Vegas, and then .org. That's where you'll find it's hosted on GitHub, by the way, which will figure in slightly to this episode today. GitHub pages, the price is right. We host all of our repositories for all of our initiatives and component projects on GitHub, thanks to the free Teams tier for nonprofits. The innovateforvegas.org website is physically located with all of those components so that we can, well, there's really no magic that we could do it in other ways too, but this makes it a piece of cake to integrate our general sort of human-oriented website with the more participant-oriented infrastructure behind GitHub and using the tools and discussions and issues and all that stuff. So they're all kind of in the same physical place, physical in the internet sense, perhaps. InnovateForVegas.org then is our original website after we changed from codeforvegas.org. And it is where you would go to learn more about what we're doing. Then there's the Innovate for Vegas Foundation website. Same spelling, Innovate for Vegas, F-O-R, no spaces, Innovate, F-O-R, Vegas, period, dot, foundation. Foundation as in our nonprofit foundation. InnovateForVegas.Foundation is the business side. They kind of look the same right now. I haven't spent any time on web design, but the InnovateForVegas.Foundation website would then, and it's also hosted on GitHub, would be where you would go to find out about our board of directors, our 990 filings, our bylaws, our whatever other code of conduct, etc. These are documents that are mostly stored in, well, where there are documents that are mostly stored in Google Workspace as, are those workspace documents, as word processing documents for the purposes of collaborating with our other board members back when we had board members. We will again. So those really need to be published for the world to see in something nice and usable like Markdown, HTML. So that's the general website collection at the moment. We'll talk a little bit more about our other two websites towards the end of this episode. We have a lot of URLs, but the Innovate for Vegas website collection. The open source initiative at opensource.org is essentially a driving force but behind open source development efforts and so on. You can visit their website and learn more about that. And they're working now on a formal definition of what open source AI is. Anyone who's followed Olama from, I think it's just Llama, or is it Olama? I don't remember. The tools are Olama, so it must be Llama. The Llama model from Meta, sometimes still referred to as Facebook, is an open source AI model with a nice asterisk next to it. So there's been controversy about what open source AI really is, the model weights being the key. Having the math available is fine, but having the showing your work is one of those points of contention. So opensource.org has I think they have a version 1 license, or definition that they've put out there for people to examine. So opensource.org, the open source initiative, big advocates for open source, all things open source. Our logo, our seal, is not trademarked. We don't have any, that's the least of our thoughts at the moment. The Innovate for Vegas Foundation seal does include an homage to the open source initiative in one of the hex tiles, since we depend on and are attempting to generate more open source stuff. So the keyhole icon, it's in there. Finally, the open source Wikipedia page, always a good resource when you are starting your journey to learn more about something. Now, open source is often used in relation to software, the ability to obtain the source code usually. There are expressions like free as in beer, free as in speech. So free speech as in you should be able to get the software. You should be able to look at the source code. You should be able to modify it as needed, identify bugs, audit for security issues, and so on and so on. Also important if a company that owns the product or whatever it is disappears, goes bankrupt, shuts down for whatever reason, the ability to continue to use the tools is important. So free speech would mean the ability to obtain those tools and use them to maybe migrate to some other platform or whatever the case may be. Free as in beer, as in you hear that expression on, it could be anything, is free of cost. Now, people often think open source means free as in beer. It does mean free as in speech most of the time. It'd be difficult to identify a case where it doesn't. I suppose like the binary blobs for NVIDIA GPU drivers were free as in beer, but not free as in source. Anyway, free as in speech. Anyway, the case for free as in cost nothing is a tricky one because even the most ridiculous license that you could possibly come up with, you essentially have to understand that the company or the entity that hosts open source things or makes open source things available is not necessarily infinitely funded. So the example that always comes to mind for me is that when I used to send away for Debian CDs back when I had my 33.6 modem, downloading Debian took a while. So you could just order the CDs and eventually a DVD. I think it came on was it 4 DVDs? And now they have, Blu-ray and all that. So, but you could send away for the CDs or DVDs and install a Debian system, a Linux system on your computer, even if you were not connected to the internet, or in my case, had a very slow connection. So they didn't send me those CDs for free. So you pay for those. So there are certain aspects of open source where you do have to account for just normal sort of business and humanity. So offsetting the cost of delivery or some other maintenance, there are some costs that are allowed. You can check the license of whatever it is you're making use of. And it's interesting that Debian, that's basically how I got into open source anything. Then when I was working at Netscape and I had access to the Netscape internet connection, I could just download what I needed from the Debian repositories. But Debian is also a staunch, they have a non-free repository infrastructure, but they are staunch supporters of open source, and they are completely open source. I'll keep it simple like that. We'll leave that there. But that is going to sound familiar as we go through today's episode. It's being completely open source and eschewing non-free or closed source or variations on that theme. So open source, and check the Wikipedia page. I didn't link to Debian. You can find Debian.org if you're really curious. Debian. Debian and Ian. I'm sorry, Deborah and Ian are co-founders of the Debian project decades ago. They may not even be around anymore, but that's another thing for another time. Anyway, let's get on with the show. Our purpose and open source fit nicely together. So our official purpose on the record in all the usual places. I often begin the show with this, not always, but it's appropriate here. So our official purpose in writing, to enable and encourage ideation, innovation, and implementation to make our communities better. It is easy to presume the pursuit of software projects, but what we aim to accomplish is bigger than that. So I was alluding to this, that open source often refers to free software. There's a whole free software foundation, in fact. But open source can take many forms, not necessarily software. Our work is, without any exceptions that have become apparent, open source. That is, our initiatives are intended to be reusable, extendable, and a part of overall collaboration to pursue our purpose by ourselves and with other cohorts near and far. The base assumption here is volunteers are not competing, and it makes more sense to multiply volunteer time, effort, and expertise by leveraging the work of others and contributing our own to that mix. Let me fix one little thing here. There we go. In so doing, we want, prefer, and essentially require the use of open source tools and methods in pursuit of our purpose, in part to keep our costs down. Open source is not always free as in beer, but it often is, which is one of the motivations to contribute our efforts to that collection of resources. In other words, you gave me a bunch of free stuff. What can we do to sort of continue that, paying it forward, if you like, however you want to look at it. But also, so not only to keep our costs down, but also to maintain that commitment to the open source ethos. Now, anyone you or anyone else, you're encouraged to build things that are not necessarily open source using open source tools and methods, right? So you can use the GCC compiler, you can host your services on an open source web server like Apache, or I guess everybody uses Nginx now, which I don't know about. I think some variants of it are open source or something. Apache Foundation is certainly open source, big, huge proponents of open source. I still use Apache, but the nature of open source is very much one way, unless you sort of proactively choose to, I guess you could say, give back. So everybody can use, and you'll often see articles about, oh, you can get all this stuff for free. And that's fine. That's how you kind of get your notion out there. Linux has become very popular because it is free, except for if you have to send away for CDs. But the notion of being able to just download an operating system and replace, that was the important aspect of it, something like proprietary and somewhat draconian Microsoft Windows, was sort of an eye-opener, and it sort of built up a marketplace. So giving out the software for free ultimately enables more people to accomplish more, and in some cases actually make money at it. Now, in some cases, some companies cannot do this sustainably, so then you end up with license hassle, where the change in license breaks other people's models who are depending on it and so on. That is something that we actually have to think about a little bit, which I'll get into. We're not building a business per se around open source, but we are executing our initiative plans using open source. So if someone were to say, oh, you can't use Linux anymore, that would be troubling. So yeah, we're committed to open source, and we want to give back to open source and also sort of plant that seed so that others who are interested in civic volunteerism also understand the value proposition when it comes to other people contributing their time, effort, and expertise to develop tools and methods that we can make use of. And then the big circle of goodness hopefully arises. So from a practical standpoint, you may or may not have experienced this back in the old days. But it was not uncommon. Once email was common, which took a little while, but it was not uncommon to receive a Microsoft Word document from someone, maybe a contract or some other element of a business transaction perhaps, which could only be opened and viewed with Microsoft Word. This has changed to the point that sending proprietary document formats to anyone is an anachronism. Pretty much, you don't do it in general unless you know for a fact that the other person, maybe you have a particular set of tools, maybe you're like AutoCAD or whatever the case may be. Although many companies got wise and they released free viewers, so you could view a document. But with so many open standards in use, it doesn't really make a tremendous amount of sense unless there's a niche that you need to it's sort of like using heavy jargon, because you know that you're conversing with someone, your interlocutors are similarly knowledgeable, right? So it's not for general consumption. But generally speaking, it's always more convenient to send open standard formats. It just solves that whole entire problem. Pick your favorite web tools or local applications. There are multiple options to open that contract document in these modern times, especially if you send it as a PDF. PDF from a company like Adobe, of all companies, has been remarkably friendly to open source tooling. The Acrobat reader and whatnot, the creation tool chain has been tricky, but PostScript, on which PDF is based, portable document format, PostScript has been around in a usable form, not the Adobe PostScript, not the original with the trademark, but GhostScript and compatible systems and so on. So the interoperability of PDF has been an interesting journey in what can be done with proprietary formats, but that are friendly to non-proprietary implementations with few headaches, apparently. And again, if you look through time, Adobe has been fairly annoying in some cases, but also not so annoying in other cases. Anyway, viewing is useful, obviously, but then what if you want to make changes to the contract, or maybe you want to accept it and that at some point you want to return a signed version of it, and we still are in a a pen and ink signature world. A digital signature would make more sense, but we're still at the I got to sign something with my finger or a pen. Basically, we want to read whatever the document is, and we may need to modify it and then write, save it, write, read, modify, write. And we want to send it back. So back in the Word days, that was always an issue until everyone had Word available, which is or was unnecessary cost sometimes, delay and frustration most of the time, and an opportunity to sell more Word for Microsoft. So Microsoft had a different variation on the Linux model. Give everything away for free and more people use Linux. Or make Word the thing that everybody uses to share documents and then require some sort of expenditure for Microsoft Word. The Microsoft, I think it was the Word Read, no, was it? Word Viewer, probably. That was around, and then the Word document format .doc was reverse engineered at some point, and then they went with docx to try to be a little bit more open with XML, binary XML, like compressed XML, I think. Anyway, so it's just part of an annoying plan. If we extend this to the general case, if you or I are working on something, not one something, who types this stuff? Yikes. If you and I are working on something, you or I, or maybe you and I, we could be working together, and we need to use some tool or method that is not at our disposal at the moment, which we need to obtain. The ability to obtain that tool or method easily and at reasonable cost, and there are cases where free software does include some costs, as I mentioned, these can make sometimes a substantial difference between continuing whatever it is we're working on or being stopped while we seek alternatives. So you can really throw a spanner in the works, as they say, if suddenly progress depends on having the full commercial install of AutoCAD or whatever the case may be. So having these tools available in some form freely or at a reasonable cost and quickly in a compatible oh no, I got to use Windows 3.1 to run this. There are still some things floating. Oh, I guess you could use COBOL as an example. Oh no, we need to hack some COBOL code to fix our entire economy. Whoops, we don't really learn COBOL anymore. Luckily, there are open source COBOL compilers out there. For learning, you may need to actually track down the original IBM compiler for whatever it is you're trying to fix, but that's a whole nother story. How about some examples? The example that has come up more often, more recently for me, from others, but not very recently, but since we've been around as a foundation, is about the use of Figma to design user interfaces, or UI. Figma is interesting and capable, not throwing shade on them. They had a nice, popular, and successful IPO, for example. They were going to be acquired by Adobe, and when that became apparent, although it did not actually happen, the PenPot project really took off. So we'll get to that in a moment. So Figma does not offer a nonprofit license nor a subscription tier, only a free tier, or you can pay for multi-user collaborations and AI features and whatever else. So I haven't really looked at the feature sets of the different tiers that Figma offers, but I do know they do not offer anything in the way of nonprofit support. Other companies do. Canva, for example, has a completely free nonprofit tier, which I make use of all the time. I'm not a graphic artist in any way. If I were to include Figma sources, so the project files for a Figma project, in our component projects repositories, and the free tier were to undergo some sort of a change that left our ability to read and edit those Figma design files removed if these were unusable without upgrading to some paid subscription tier, for example, or maybe Figma would just go out of business or be acquired by some other company, or who knows. The value of the contributions to the component project in question is reduced, maybe even undone completely, if we just can't use those files anymore. Now, historically, there are ways around this, especially if something as widely used as Figma were to become unusable, disappear, change their file formats, whatever. Somebody would take that on, or many people sometimes, because there's actual value in that not happening. But that does happen sometimes. I'm not suggesting it's going to happen with Figma, but it's happened enough through history that for an organization like ours, it doesn't really make sense to commit to become dependent on Figma products and services for our free efforts. Because guess what? If we have to deal with some change, you are taking away time, effort, and expertise from pursuit of initiatives for community elevation, making our communities better. Remember that part? And spending it on trying to deal with the business practices of a company that we have no other relations with. So PenPot, I talked about PenPot in, I think, 2 episodes ago or so, 3. PenPot is open source, and there are some other tools that are a little bit more web page design specific, like Web Studio, which I just started playing with the other day. Very interesting. They're coming along. PenPot is very capable, but it's a little, well, I mean, I'm not a graphic designer. It's basically, I would call it something similar to Adobe Illustrator. It's more of an object editor, which I think I'm going to say that again. Closer to CAD than to website layout. Web Studio, on the other hand, you're actually placing a button, not an object that you can call a button in PenPot. Now, I've only started playing with PenPot, so I know there are libraries and extensions and all sorts of other doodads to make specific website design, web page layout easier. I'm just a beginner. But Web Studio is a little bit more intuitive, a little bit maybe less capable or less flexible. But either way, those are only 2 tools. There are many. If we move to designing electronics or mechanical objects, there are open source tools for circuit design and simulation, board layout, and of course CAD tools to work with physical design of the electronics and maybe some other mechanical systems. There are full 2D and 3D CAD systems available in open source today, and they're very capable. Here again, if there are contributions to these types of component projects in our initiatives or in general, which require some proprietary tools, we run into a similar problem. If there is one thing the maker movement has enabled, it is free and open tools and standards to enable these more tangible development efforts. That is, making things that you can hold in your hand, not just software. It is free and open tools and standards. I skipped a line. More tangible. I thought I was going to emphasize that point, but no. And before you wonder what on earth would require mechanical design, remember that 3D printing is easily available in other programmable small scale manufacturing for self-hosted physical manufacture. Other methods are coming along using lasers or chemical processes, so like laser cutters, or chemical processes or other approaches enabled by open source tools and methods for more people to use. So here the idea is you buy the 3D printer and you get the tools for free. Companies like Intel do that too. Intel was, and I think still is, although some of their open source developers are leaving, but open source is something that Intel was proactively contributing to once they got over the, what? Give stuff away? But then they started realizing, oh, wait, we really are a hardware company. And more people using our hardware is a good thing. So similar with 3D printers and various other things. So, and here again, open source doesn't mean everything is free from, top to bottom, from start to finish, etc. But you could look at RepRap, which later became MakerBot. One of their goals was to be able to have MakerBot make itself. So a MakerBot could make a copy of itself. And you could have 2 MakerBots as long as you had the materials. Well, you have to go buy the materials, but the printer design was open source and the software to run it was open source. So you can accomplish a lot of things. You could modify it. You could build whole businesses around it, which is arguably maybe not the only factor, but something that was seminal in the explosion of 3D printing for everyone. Sometimes there are tools that we ourselves are using, for example, in our foundation, which are free to use, but are not free to modify. Now, they're free to use under certain terms. Obvious examples, Google Workspace, thanks to the Google for Nonprofits tier. So we are licensed for as many people as join our organization, our board members, and so on, for free, but we have no access or control over those tools, or we can't modify or fix or change. We have to follow their terms. We can't self-deploy and so on. So it's free for our fledgling nonprofit to use for communication and document sharing and whatnot. GitHub as a nonprofit has a nonprofits service tier. Their teams tier, which you can get for a nonprofit. You don't have to be a charity. Now, Google requires that you are a 501c3 charity, so they call it Google for Nonprofits, but Nonprofit as a state designation. 501c3 is an IRS determination based on the 501a rules. So you can dive into that if you want. GitHub, though, has their nonprofit service tier, so you only have to be a nonprofit. And in fact, they seem to be much more. It's a Microsoft company, by the way. Don't forget that. Sort of surprising. They are more eager to provide free stuff to anyone working on open source. That's really what they like. So if you're working on an open source project, but you're more of a club, or you are not an incorporated nonprofit entity, certainly if you're not a 501c3 public charity, they still seem willing to have a conversation at the very least. We have a Project Act organization on GitHub. It receives the tier designate or free tier designation for service level, even though it is only an initiative that we are driving. So we are basically its fiscal sponsor. And they were like, "Oh, sure, good luck. Hope it goes well." Bam, done. So GitHub is pretty good about that, and we've been using it. It's been available to us for years now. It was it was a new tier of service when we actually received our determination, but it took forever to receive any acknowledgement. But they didn't argue. They said, "Oh, we got it. You're all set up." That was essentially after a few months. Now it's days. They've really integrated into their service offering. Has added capabilities for collaboration and not costing us anything. Is a nice touch, since we don't really drive donations at this time. Eventually, strictly speaking, these are administrative tools, and to say that they are free, you have to kind of put some air quotes up there. And as it happens, they are replaceable with open source solutions, and that's the important part. So let's talk about self-hosting. Replacing things like Google Workspace and GitHub and other stuff is possible using other cloud services, Zoho and GitLab, for example, respectively. And there are others still. But as we pursue innovation across all areas we can, taking ownership of more and more of our infrastructure may make sense. Trust me, I have encountered too many practical scenarios over the last 30 years or so where having the ability to fix or modify something is better than not. Am I going to rip open a cloud-hosted or self-hosted cloud deployment of NextOffice? Is that what it's called? Nextcloud, sorry, which is one example of a self-hostable Google Workspace replacement. Probably not, but you never know. You never know. Having it and not needing it, that saying. Self-hosting then, where we can deploy tools on our own servers, apply updates, look for defect issues, or file new issues in their own bug database, GitHub or wherever, and participate. And by the way, the GitHub issue tracking tools are okay, but I have my issues with their issues. We can participate in improving these tools, perhaps. Fits nicely into the big picture, if you will, of being open source development aficionados. This is not a one-person pursuit to manage infrastructure like that, to become so involved with our infrastructure to manage deployments and then track bugs and interact with the upstream developers and so on. But even one person could deploy some tools and manage updates at a functional level, keep the lights on, if you like. And so that's probably where we will begin. Are we beginning tomorrow? No. But these are options to have available and explore them, so we don't get too surprised if we suddenly need them. Sometimes self-hosting applies to an organization level, like we would self-host something that everybody uses. Sometimes self-hosting may apply to a team or individual level. Maybe somebody working on a mechanical project needs to share some CAD tools, and they make use of online, cloud-based resources. They can either self-host or maybe use someone else's. Something like PenPot, for example, if you're doing something simple that's like a 2D object-oriented interaction, and then you intend to have that printed or in some way manufactured or something. I'm just making an example here, but this may not be something for the entire organization to look at. At one point, someone suggested we use Twilio, I think it was, for Kanban boards. Is that Twilio? Anyway, they said, why don't we use that? And I said, well, there is a free tier, but that could go away, and it's also another thing to manage. So why don't you try it and then we'll see if it works. And then if it works for everybody, then we'll add it to our tool mix. That never happened because it's not easy. There has to be a value proposition. Rather famously, a former colleague of mine when I worked at Netscape, Jamie Swinski, has been known to say that I don't think it was open source. I think it was free software is only free if your time is worth nothing. That is very cynical, but it is also true. Sometimes self-hosting applies at the organizational level, like I said, or the team or the individual. And I may want to deploy something that I need to use. And then if it works out, if I can self-host it, that means that we can self-host it. So we may not just deploy self-hosted tools for the sake of it, but actually sort of promote things that people are starting to use. And we would prefer those to something like a closed source or commercial thing that we have no ability to self-host or to work with into the future. It is likely that all such tools would be self-hosted for the entire organization once they sort of get that promotion or they kind of prove themselves to work, in as much as they would be used to maintain component projects and whatnot at the very least. So if I use a self-hosted tool to build something, and then I say, okay, I used, say, Penpot. I used Penpot to design the user interface, to the layout of all the different user views for the user interface and the user experience. So let's deploy a self-hosted version of the Penpot platform, which we can do, so that anyone can not only make use of the contributions I made to this particular component project, but also to any into the future. We can actually integrate these tools into our workflow. So, whatever the path to eventually controlling more of our platform development toolkit, that just makes sense in general for what we're trying to accomplish. This flexibility is a winner, even if there is some time, effort, and expertise to apply to deployment and maintenance. So in other words, you have to point some of your efforts to the infrastructure and not spend all of your time working on actual initiatives, because part of it is being able to build them, whatever they are. It could be software, it could be hardware, it could be whatever it is. Having the tools and the functionality at your disposal to accomplish those things is part of the overall journey, if you like. So our self-deployment plans are pretty straightforward. We have a few domains, by the way, for our organization, including our .org and .foundation domains. I always mention at the top of these episodes of this program. Since we added the .foundation for the business side of our endeavors, I've moved to just talking about those two. I used to mention Agile for Volunteers and Project Act. Those are initiatives, but our actual foundation, our actual nonprofit corporation, has those two sort of top level for their specific purposes, which I already described at the top of the episode. Another is the .xyz domain, which sounds strange. Why would we need that? Which we use it as a sandbox, of course. There is a GitHub organization for it and everything. Innovate for Vegas XYZ. And is there a website? I can't remember if I've deployed a website for it. So why would we need a sandbox? Well, it's for trying out ideas, forking other projects from other organizations, which would not be a part of our initiative collection, which would mean if I needed to fork Penpot, would I do it into our Innovate for Vegas collection of repositories? Well, it's a completely separate entity. It has different licensing. It has different anything. So rather than forking the project into our main organization collection of repositories, we could fork it into our sandbox, and there anything goes. Still same code of conduct and whatnot in collaboration there, but we wouldn't be enforcing any sort of top level contributing policies or licensing or other. Those are based on the repository that was forked into our, and we may need to fork it to make some of our own modifications. Maybe we want to collaborate on some eventual pull requests, right? So we may want to say, hey, as a group, we make use of Penpot, but we're going to modify something and propose it to them in the form of a pull request in the GitHub universe. So that's the sandbox, XYZ. And then there is the .dev, innovateforvegas.dev, which is presently completely undeployed. So if you go there, you're not going to find much. Innovateforvegas.dev, DEV as in development. The idea here is to deploy to self-host various tools that will or already do come in handy. A few examples. Excalidraw which I use as a shared whiteboard of sorts, basically to illustrate org charts or other lists and whatever the case may be during our office hours and other meetups that we've had online. Excalibur is very cool, totally usable, can be self-hosted. I use their free version on their hosted site. You can pay for additional services, but we can also just download the project and self-host it. They have instructions and everything. That's kind of a theme with self-hosted stuff. There's the business model of self-hosted, by the way, is if you don't want to self-host, you can just pay us some money every month, and we will host it for you, and we'll maintain it, we'll update it, and all that stuff. So options are nice. Penpot, which I spelled Panpot for some reason. Penpot, which is useful for object design, and this is often compared with Figma for layout. I also mentioned the Web Studio. Web Studio is still early in its development, so they recommend not self-hosting. They right away they say there's a self-hosting tier, but we recommend you don't use it unless you're in development, because we are actively developing this product, so it's not ready for prime time. But there are various tools that we could use so that anyone could join in the development efforts, or could look at our files without needing to purchase a license for something or sign up for some other service, etc. We could have a listserv, basically a self-hosted newsletter or other mailings. A listserv is a mailing list server. There are many open source variations on that theme. We could also deploy a news server. Remember Usenet News? Probably not. An IRC server, our Internet Relay Chat. The old school stuff is already from this mindset where you would be deploying it yourself. Make config, make install. Remember those days? And available in or compatible with most, if not all, Linux distributions. So if there's not a Debian package for it, you can probably install it in some other ways. Now there's a Snapd. What do they call that? Well, there's Flatpak and App Image, and then whatever the Snapd is. I can't remember what that stands for. If you're what is it called? Ubuntu. I was going to say Unity. That's their. Anyway, enough about that. There is a will and there's a way, and they are often found in the world of Linux and open source in general. Forgejo. Forgejo. I'll probably talk about this more in the future if we go with this. Is exploding onto the scene lately as more and more people get a little bit tired of GitHub shenanigans. By the way, I read the Empire AI book by Karen Howe, H-A-O, Karen Howe. And part of the development process once OpenAI became entangled with Microsoft, they said, we need more training data. And so Microsoft said, well, here's all of the GitHub stuff. So some people did not find that good. They were not amused. And there have been other things. So GitHub is not necessarily everybody's favorite. There are some good things and there are some bad things. So we are likely to continue using GitHub at the free tier. That's fine. It does a lot of good things. But the ability to deploy our own version of a GitHub-like platform to manage all the things that GitHub does, issues, discussions, all that stuff, everything. So I haven't actually dived into Forgejo yet, but Forgejo is itself a fork of Gittea. I think that's how you say it, G-I-T-E-A, Gittea. So Gittea, G-I-T-E-A. But Gittea changed their licensing terms. Sound familiar? They changed enough so that a group of people interested in continuing to use it the way they wanted to use it forked the open source version of Gittea, and now Forgejo exists. And if you've heard of the website called Codeberg, which is based in Germany, I believe it is, they are rapidly becoming a popular alternative to both GitHub and GitLab. And GitLab is something that I believe you can still self-host if you want. So, but GitLab has its own weirdness. So Forgejo may take the top spot, and we'll continue to use GitHub as like a secondary. So that's fine. And then there's some workplace replacements. There are many options, including Nextcloud, which you may have heard of. Production by Street. You may have heard of Nextcloud, and there are various others which you may not have. Do we need to have a cloud document platform? It comes in handy sometimes, but if we use open formats, open standards, then you should be able to use whatever editor or application you would like to. So we don't need to depend on the web version of something. That's a discussion to be had in the future. Right now, Google Workspace is not annoying enough to want to leave tomorrow, but there are some things. Ideally, we would move member and email management into something that is not intimately connected to documents, for example. So having better control the way we want for how we manage users. And by the way, even though the nonprofit tier of Google Workspace does enable us to have pretty much, I don't know if there's a real limit. Probably there's a practical limit. I don't know if there's a business or license limit, but we can have dozens, hundreds, I don't even know, of users, and we can have multiple domains and so on. And I take advantage of those things. So that's fine. But if we were self-hosting, we could probably do all those things and not have to worry about it. We just wouldn't be getting the bandwidth that Google is picking up. So the server, compute, bandwidth, all the facilities that enable the Google Workspace tier for nonprofits for free would not be free. So that's where one of the trade-offs would be. So something to think about. The workspace replacement will probably be the most difficult because of the number of options to select from. There are too many choices. And do we want to go with cloud-hosted document editing and so on, document collaboration? Do we want to? And by the way, we could just keep Google Workspace also. So it's having too many choices is not the worst problem to have. And more, including our own tools as they come along, maybe for Agile for Volunteers and Project Act, for examples, the ability to do the spidering of websites, to pick up on the self-hosted tile documents, to construct the Project Act cohort database would be something. And that would be a tool that we develop. It could be a combination of tools that we develop and tools that we make use of, Apache Jenna, for example. And then we would make those tools available for others to self-host. So we would be on the other side of that equation. Same with Agile for Volunteers and everything else. Integrating Agile for Volunteers into Forge, Joe, that would be cool. Can't really do that with GitHub. Not easily. Maybe with another time. There are tools like Jitsi. Jitsi is I think it's still open source. Jitsi is like it's like Zoom, but open source. Which we do use for our video meetups, our office hours, and so on. Not to mention Matrix. Matrix is an open source. It's actually more of an architecture, and then Element implements some of the software itself. But the Matrix, I think it's the Matrix Foundation. They do an open source, an open standard communication platform, chat, end-to-end encrypted and group chat, encrypted group chat they've got some interesting ideas. Some people don't like the way they're doing it, but hey, they're doing it. So Matrix, very interesting. I met them at a hackathon in London a decade ago when they were still very new. I use Element, so we could deploy our own Matrix server, and we could deploy Jitsi, and we could self-host these things. It almost goes without saying that we could self-host our own Mastodon instance for our organization, not to mention any other Fediverse tools like PixelFed to share photos, like from hackathons, as we bring those back, hopefully, and PeerTube to share videos, think talks.vegas, so we don't need to depend on YouTube. So what you end up with when you self-host is you give yourself more options, but you don't have to completely shun. We could deploy PeerTube and then also use YouTube, and then if YouTube ever becomes unusable, we don't have to be in panic mode to replace it. We just say, okay, well, we're still using our self-hosted platform that still works. So that's a matter of then communication, maybe via a Mastodon's post. Hey, don't forget YouTube has kicked us off. You have to go to PeerTube, whatever the case may be. When you depend too much on third-party platforms, when things change, you discover just how much you depended on them, which is not always a great thing. There are tools like Jitsi, like I said. Jitsi is great, although bandwidth for video conferencing and whatnot, just like PeerTube, would be a challenge. But I really like Jitsi just because of the nature of what they're doing. The company that I think that still owns it, 8x8. I actually had an opportunity to meet with the CEO when they were based in Sunnyvale, and I did a podcast with him. It was a long time ago for Radio Sunnyvale about doing business in Sunnyvale. So the company he's not the CEO anymore, but the company attitude seems to have remained, which is really, they do understand the value of that sort of community outreach, which, it's good. So, and fun fact, there are some cohorts from the brigade days, the Code for America Brigade timeline, that depended on services like Slack and Google Workspace and Zoom and probably others that were paid for or basically, covered by Code for America. So each brigade had their own Slack and their own Zoom, whatever it was. So when the brigade program was sunset, these various brigades suddenly found themselves without all these tools as their subscriptions became their own responsibility and so on. So I was discussing this with the Alliance of Civic Technologists people in their early days. I can't remember when this was. They said, "Oh, we have to pay for Zoom for this, and there's Slack and everything." And I said, and we were having a conversation in a Discord server, which is ironically free. Like, why do you need Slack? You can just use Discord if you really need that functionality. I mean, you're not a corporation you're not a big giant corporation. We're a corporation, but you're not a big giant company that needs the resources of Slack when conversations like this are probably sufficient. And if you do need Slack, guess what? There are self-hostable alternatives. So, yeah, but we need to have video, this. I said, I'm going to create a meetup right now for free. And I signed in with my GitHub credentials. They don't want everybody just randomly creating video chat instances all the time. But so I logged in with my GitHub credentials, created a meetup, video meetup, chat room, whatever you want to call it. I posted it in the Discord chat and I said, here, we're having a video meetup right now. It cost me $0. So that's where the Jitsi came into being. We could use Google Meet, Google Meet for our meetings. That would be fine. But we also are showing that it's possible to not have to have a Google account. You don't have to use their services. It can be done very easily. So we're kind of, it's not our own, but the expression eat your own dog food, right? We should be able to pursue open source solutions to challenges, problems, requirements, and so on. Where they can be found, we should put them to use so that we do not find ourselves in a position where we depend on Google Meet for our meetings. What? We don't have it anymore? Even I don't really like depending on the Google Calendar servers that I publish our event schedules to. Like, I would rather own those schedules. Guess what? iCalendar Streams, CalDave, these are all open standards. They've been around for decades. We are going to move in that direction. So using open source tools, open methods, open protocols, open file formats is a game changer if you want to have a sustainable entity that also pursues open source. Only good things come of this fertile mixture, this a virile environment of creativity and solution forming. Anyway, I'll stop ad-libbing now. And everything I've said today just really only barely scratches the surface. We have a lot to do, and there are a lot of tools and methods at our disposal, thanks to others who had a lot to do and did a lot of it for the benefit of others like us. So being a part of that cycle of open source benefit and so on, it sounds politically divisive to some, but the case is you are using open source software right now, whether you know it or not, and you're probably benefiting from it, and you probably have not given back financially or otherwise. So sometimes there are better outcomes than can be measured in quarterly bottom line profits and so on. So yeah, there you go. But we also want to be able to continue to maintain our stuff and not depend on the changing license environments and whatnot. And if you need to have examples of that, you can look at MySQL, MySQL, Redis, Terraform. There have been several over the years. Code for America's change of plans were just as detrimental. Now, if Code for America had implemented a completely open source, if you will, platform to enable the brigades to continue to function without, hey, instead of using Slack and Zoom, we're going to use, let's say, Mattermost and Jitsi. So now instead of paying for, seat licenses or whatever for these different platforms, you're paying for maybe some cloud hosting. And our locality, wherever we're based, we have a business here that wants to sponsor our cloud hosting. Maybe they're a cloud hosting company. So maybe you have your cloud hosted for free or as a donation to your organization. Well, now you freed yourself up for the circumstances that everybody found themselves in where Code for America shut down the brigade program. The only reason it hung on for dear life was that all of the brigades said, wait a minute, we need all that stuff that we were using. And so yeah, panic mode is not the best way to do things. It's not the best place to be. So yeah, we're just avoiding all that and keeping it open source. Cooking with open source. Thanks for listening as always. And we're coming up on the end of the year. Don't forget, Smarter City Hackathon plans for 2026. Keep an eye out. I'm sure I will talk about it again. Take care now. Bye-bye.